Welcome in, everyone. Glad to have you on board. Steve Lennox, Lennox on Baseball live stream podcast, a little baseball chat today with longtime Major League Baseball PR man, Rick Vaughn, with both the Baltimore Orioles and the Tampa Bay Rays. Rick, I opened up with Sweet Caroline from Fenway Park in Boston, so there's that AL East theme. Sorry, I don't have anything yet from Baltimore or the team down there.
Well, you know what? I have some ambivalent feelings about that because when we were there as a visiting team, you kind of got sick of that. But I have to say, the guy who started that at Fenway is a good friend of mine, Charles Steinberg, who was in charge of all the in-game entertainment there. And he's the one that started that, put that song in that slot, just like he did many years before with Country Boy. Thank God I'm a Country Boy at Memorial Stadium, which was, there forever and ever for the seventh inning stretch.
Perfect. I love it. Rick, we're going to get into your career here. Rick, of course, got his start in baseball with the Orioles in 1984. That was the beginning. And then he got in with the Rays right at the ground level, as we'll touch on as well. But, sometimes timing works out very well. Your former organization, the Tampa Bay Rays, yesterday unveiling their new City Connect uniforms. What did you think of the unveil? What do you think of the City Connect uniforms?
Well, you know what? I applaud what what the attempt is there. There's always that drive to try to reach younger people, make it a hip thing to wear. I mean, that's really what you're going for, is that when you walk down the street, you see teenagers and youngsters wearing that shirt. So I think they did a great job in pinpointing that. Skateboarding is huge in St. Pete because of the weather. They have some really big national tournaments there in Tampa. So I think they struck a nerve, and I think it looks really cool. I think they did a great job.
We always talk about baseball never having an off season. You're a few years removed from working day in, day out, month to month with the Tampa Bay Rays organization. What are you doing present day?
Well, I first and foremost, when I left the Rays, I immediately was looking for something to do, and so I started volunteering, and that's probably been the best thing that I've done. It's connected me with a whole different universe of other people that are like-minded, that all we want to do is help. There's no agenda. We just want to be able to help people that need help. So I've been volunteering at a couple of places, Metropolitan Ministries here in Tampa and the Homeless Empowerment Program in Clearwater. The Homeless Empowerment Program hired me a couple months ago, so I'm sort of a consultant, a PR consultant for them, and loving that. They need somebody with a little bit of experience at that. And so I've been able to teach them some stuff, get some programs up and running to try to create some awareness. And then I do, I score the complex league games down here. I live 15 minutes from where the Phillies play and about 12 minutes from where the Blue Jays play. So I spend a lot of time on those back fields. These are games these are low minor league games, and you're on the backfield as far as you can get from anybody else. And you might see a girlfriend and maybe a couple of scouts. Other than that, it's the umpires, the players, and me. And I really enjoy it. It keeps my hand in the game. And the season starts on Saturday. So I'll be in Dunedin at their complex on Saturday.
You touched on before we went live, Rick, similar to what the Gulf Coast League used to be. Is that accurate?
It is. Yeah, it is. Many of those kids are first-time professional. They're in their first season. Many of them are from Latin America. The one thing that's really kind of cool about it is the local teams here, if they draft a high school kid in the first or the early rounds or whatever, they're going to probably end up in that league. So last year I got to see, and I can't remember either one of their names, but I got to see the Blue Jays and the Phillies first round pick last year, the Tigers first round pick when they came in. So that was kind of cool seeing them in their first pro games, guys that are probably going to end up in the big leagues at some point. So it's a mixture, but it's really young people. There's still a lot of teaching going on. I mean, it's not the instructional league, but it is a league where you see some crazy stuff. Sometimes you see athleticism that just blows you away with some of the plays that are made. They're major league plays. But then there are guys that maybe have to think twice on tagging up on a fly ball at third base with less than 2 out. So you see, you never know what you're going to see at those games, but I really enjoy it.
And similar, a lot of people would say similar to what you see at the major league level right now with, still developing those skills.
Sadly, yes. I've seen that way too often. I mean, I was just telling my neighbor this morning. I think, I watch a lot of baseball. I have the MLB package and all, and I think the last 7 times in all these games I've watched over the last month, the last like 7 or 8 times to watch a guy get a bunt down, I've seen it successful once.
Yeah.
The other 7 or 8 times, they can't get the bunt. They can't get a bunt down. And I hear announcers say, well, they don't bunt because they really don't know how, and that really sort of, I know that the analytics are, they don't like to give up an out. I get it. But I always was was always my thought where if you put the ball in play, something can happen. Something bad can happen to the other team. And you just don't, see that happen much anymore. And that's one part. I like a lot of the changes they've made to the game. I like the pitch clock. They started using that in the Florida State League about 3 or 4 years ago. And I remember the first game that I covered, I was like, oh man, I'm going to hate this clock. And after about 2 innings, I forgot it was even there. It's actually a great concept. It just changes everybody's mindset. I know the union is saying that it's leading to injuries to the pitchers. I don't know how much of that's really true, but I think it's been the best new rule to come into play. And so that part I like, but I wish the players, still had some of those old school instincts that they were taught how to bunt properly and stuff like that.
Yeah, you bring that up, and I always go back to my days in minor league baseball as a broadcaster. And at one point, the broadcasters did talk about, well, what are they teaching them in the minor leagues? And we all kind of looked around the room in the manager's office to say, he was asked to get, the number 3 hitter was asked to get a bunt down in this situation because it called for it. And you might be called for it in the big league. So learn how to do it, present day. And everyone just kind of scratched their heads. Well, we did. They had satisfaction, and we did our part in trying to teach that skill.
I didn't see a lot of that in spring training. The last time I saw an emphasis on bunting would go back to when Lou Piniella was managing the Rays. It was probably 2005, and part of the batting practice regimentation during spring training was that there was a pitching machine set up on the back behind the backstop with that foul ground back there, and that was part of your work. Your station to station was you would bunt. Everybody had to go back there and bunt off the machine. That's the last time I remember seeing any kind of emphasis on it at all.
So something else that you've been involved with over the last couple of years, 2-time author now. First book released in 2022, 100 Years of Baseball on St. Petersburg Waterfront. Your most recent release in March, Tampa Spring Training Tales, Major League Memories. Give us an idea of how you went about putting those projects together.
Yeah, I was never intending to write a book. At that point, I was 65 years old and had, enjoyed the writing and the research. But just to make a long story short, I had been in St. Petersburg. This was back during COVID. I went down there for a walk, and I happened to walk past Al Lang Stadium, and I looked up at it, and the name on the stadium was gone. And I'm like, how can that be? How can the stadium name be gone? That a ballpark has been on that site since 1922. It started as Waterfront Park, then it was Al Lang Field, then it was Al Lang Stadium. And it just kind of bothered me. So I actually made an appointment through a friend with a member of the city council in St. Pete. And again, this was during COVID. So it was like he had to come in the office because he wasn't in there much. And I met with him, and he thought it was a great idea. He said, we need to come up with a better way to memorialize that stadium. And as I would learn to find out, more than 200 Hall of Famers played on those fields there. So he was all for it. He says, yeah, can you help us do the research and maybe some ideas on what we could do? And so I started working on it. And after about a month, I started sending him stuff, and I got crickets. I never heard back from him again. But at that point, I had done quite a bit of research, and I had been there, as the PR director for the Rays. We trained there the first 10 years, and I had been there a couple times. The Orioles. I was with the Orioles, and we trained there for a year or two. So I had what I thought was pretty extensive education on the ballparks there. I didn't know anything. I started researching, and I'm like, if I didn't know this, I think a lot of people wouldn't know this. So I'm working on this, and my wife is like, you know what? Why don't you write a book? And I said, I just don't think I have the energy to do it. But as it turned out, I kept researching it, and there was the story for me was how closely intertwined the city and baseball was, starting like around 1915 when Al Lang first got to St. Petersburg from Pittsburgh. And to me, that was a story that needed to be told. And I'll just give you sort of a little bit of the highlights along the way. But even from the very beginning, when Al Lang came down from Pittsburgh, he was a young man that had made a lot of money early in his life as in the laundry business, but he got sick, and the doctors had told him, "You have to get out of this climate." So he really didn't even know where St. Pete was. He and his wife Marie got on a train and took it as far south as they could at the time, and the Atlantic coastline went right down to the waterfront at St. Pete, which was literally right across the street from where he would oversee building 3 different ballparks. And he realized that, he fell in love with the city and realized that tourism was going to be the thing that take this city to new heights. And he also realized that baseball was going to be the engine to do that. And so right from the very beginning, he had his heart set on not just bringing spring training baseball to St. Pete, but bringing the larger market teams in. And in 1922, he got the Boston Braves to come. They played at Waterfront Park, which is approximately where Al Lang Stadium is today. So he had the number 3 largest media market at the time. And lo and behold, 3 years later, he got the New York Yankees. And the Yankees and the Braves played games there. The Braves didn't leave until 1937, but he had 2 of the 3 largest media markets playing in St. Pete. And it got to the point, I thought this was really kind of funny. It got to the point where everybody knew where St. Pete was if you were a baseball fan up north. And they didn't even bother to put what state it was. It just said, the date lines just said St. Petersburg. And they didn't need to put Florida in there because everybody knew what it was. And it just really, and then even when the Depression hit in the 20s and the 30s, I found one historian who told me that he really felt that St. Petersburg came out of the Depression earlier than a lot of other Florida cities, partly because the first 3 months of every year, there was a lot of moneyed people there from New York and Boston who were spending money in the economy, and Al Lang was spending money in the economy, and the Yankees and the Braves were. So it actually helped get them out of the Depression. And then you take it all the way up to during the Civil Rights era, I think, and I got to talk to Bill White a little bit about this when I was writing the book. And, he basically said the same thing to me, which was that I had sort of learned already, was that, Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in 1947. And everybody maybe at that time thought things were going in the right direction. And maybe they were, but they weren't in spring training. Jim Crow laws were still the rule here. And players, black players and white players could not live together. And so in the early 60s, Bill White was one of the main guys. The players from the Cardinals and the Yankees, Elston Howard was one, they started speaking up. And the Yankees, in fact, ended up leaving after the 61 season. And they had been there since 1925. One of the reasons they left was they wanted their own ballpark because they were still sharing it. At that time, they were sharing it with the Cardinals. But one of the other reasons was they wanted a hotel where everybody could be under one roof, and they found that in Fort Lauderdale, interestingly enough, at a hotel called the Yankee Clipper. But they went south, and finally, the pressure that was being put on by the players in St. Pete, and there was a doctor in St. Pete by the name of Wimbish, Dr. Wimbish, African-American doctor, who was putting up some of the players, the African-American players, in his house. They couldn't stay in the hotel. And in 1961, he finally realized, I'm contributing to the problem. I'm not helping it. And he said, enough. I love these guys. They're like my brothers, but they're not going to stay with me anymore because we have to do something about this. And eventually that's what happened. And by 1962, the Cardinals and the Mets came in after the Yankees into St. Pete. They found accommodations that would let all of their players stay under one roof. And the Cardinals, I think, ended up buying a hotel out near the Skyway Bridge so that could happen. But here you had, you had this. Now, in 1964, the Civil Rights Act came, but baseball was behind. And I think, St. Petersburg certainly was a lightning rod. Bill Veeck down in Sarasota was a lightning rod. He was progressive in his thinking. He got his players all in one hotel in Sarasota. So St. Pete kind of had this, connection with the game all the way through. And then the Mets came in, Yankees left in 61, Mets came in 62, and they didn't leave till 87. So if you think about that, other than the war years, the 43 through 1945, when there was no spring training in the South. They had to train north because they wanted to travel restrictions because of World War II. But from 1925 to 1987, except for those 3 years, you had New York media here every year talking about the virtues of St. Petersburg. I don't think anybody could put even close to coming up with a price tag for that, considering that's over 60 years of, the largest megaphone in the country. And they were writing baseball, but they were also writing about the city as well. And so I think if you look at it in those terms, what a great way to promote your city. And Al Lang was, he was the engine for all of that. He was amazing. And he even was to the point where he wasn't just St. Pete's ambassador. He was Florida's ambassador. If you wanted to bring a team to Florida for spring training in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, early 60s, because he passed early in the early, you went to him. He was the man to see, to let you know how to figure it out, to how to maneuver what you needed to maneuver, and to really exaggerate what was going to happen when that ball club got to that city. So I had a blast writing about it. I loved writing about the Cardinals. The Cardinals were there even longer. They were there from 37 until 97. And at that time, they were the only team, west of the Mississippi. They were the West team for a decade or two. And so they were another huge megaphone. So I loved reading about all of that. And there were many stories connected to that. So that was why, and then I ended up finding a publisher, Arcadia Publishing, and I got it published. And I didn't really care if I sold a book, to be honest with you. It was therapy for me, being in baseball for 31 years and then not being in it. It was hard, but this gave me a reason every day, to look up baseball stuff, write about baseball, and every once in a while find something that was really amazing. I know it was spring training, but it was still some really good stories that came out of it.
So your third book, 31 Years in Baseball, Rick Vaughn's story. I thought about this and how to put this together. There'll be a chapter, the ownership groups that you worked for and the men that you worked for.
Yes, you sound like my wife, by the way.
Absolutely
I can't let her see this video.
What has to be in there? Oriole ownerships that you worked for, Devil Ray organization, and owners that you worked for.
Yeah, and working for the Orioles early on, Edward Bennett Williams owned the team. He was the head of.
You went through 3 different owners, including Mr.
Angelos, who just I did. Yes, yeah. Mr. Williams was the founder and the owner, basically, of Williams and Conley, which was, arguably the biggest law firm in the United States. I mean, he represented half of the mafia. Ollie North, Jimmy Hoffa, the Washington Post. They were the biggest law firm, I think it's safe to say, in the country. He lived in Washington, D.C., so the fan base was always worried he was going to move the team to Washington after the Senators, because the Senators were gone. That never happened. Mr. Williams, I think, was really, may have been, the most solid owner that I really ever worked for. I had no idea at the time. But then Eli Jacobs came along, did not last very long. When Mr. Williams died in 88, Eli bought the team and lasted a few years. And then Peter Angelos came in 92 and bought the club then. Now, the other part of it is when I left the Orioles, I went to work for the Redskins for a couple of years. And there is no more eccentric owner in the history of ownership than Jack Kent Cooke, who was, as a fan, you loved him because he won 3 Super Bowls. And, he was the kind of owner when they needed somebody, he just didn't go out and get somebody. He went out and got the very best. If they needed a linebacker, they went out and got Wilbur Marshall. If they needed a wide receiver, they went out and got Roy Jefferson, guys that were all pros. And so he was a great owner as a fan, but I could write a whole book about my 2 years with him. He was so eccentric on and the stuff that I had to go through. And I was more like his personal valet whenever he was around than I was the PR guy. And so fortunately for me, the Rays called in 96. And I was, we had been down here for spring training for a number of years and we loved it. And that was only living 6 weeks a year, 7 weeks a year. And the weather wasn't bad. it wasn't the hot summer. But then came down here, worked for Vince Namoli, and Vince was probably the right guy to get the team here. He was like a bull rusher, man. He just didn't take no from anybody. And he was the guy who successfully led the effort to get the team. But once he got the team, he really didn't want to let go any of the managing aspects of the organization. And it was to his detriment. I mean, he was not qualified to do it. And I had sent him a bunch of memos early on saying, in the nicest way that I could, that these are things that we probably need to think about doing. And one of them was, the first one on the list, I still have the memo somewhere, was you need to step away from the day-to-day leadership of the organization and hire a team president. And he never did. And it was just too much for him. He couldn't live in a fishbowl. It was too hard on him. Everything, when you own a major league team, you're in the spotlight. There's nothing you do that doesn't get, dissected. And he just wasn't able to handle that very well. And then obviously Stu Sternberg bought the club in 2004, brought in a whole new way of looking at things with the Wall Street analytics and stuff. And, it's really hard to argue with the success they've had. Now, they won a World Series? No. Have they drawn very well? Haven't drawn 2 million people since they've owned the club. Haven't been able to host an all-star game because it's just not going to happen at the Trop. It's not a place that it would work very well for. But, I mean, they turned that team around. Joe Madden had a lot to do with that, too. Andrew Friedman had a lot to do with that. And I think Andrew, probably as much as Joe, deserves the credit for what happened there. I mean, I can remember having a conversation with him early in 06 or 07, and I was like, about our lineup. And I'm like, where are we going to get runs out of that? And he just kind of slapped me a little bit on the shoulder. He was like, it doesn't matter how many we score, it's how many we're going to give up. And we're not going to give up a lot. And he knew it. He knew that. He knew the defensive metrics. And we had a good starting staff. We had really good defense. So we didn't give up. We didn't give up a lot of runs. We didn't score a ton, but we beat teams, with our pitching and our defense. And it was fun to watch. It was great to be a part of all that.
So 1991, the Orioles close out Memorial Stadium the next year in Camden Yards. Anytime I think about Camden Yards, two things. I was very fortunate years ago to get an introduction to Janet Marie Smith. 2 years ago, I did my first ESPN radio game at Dodger Stadium. And I said, I just said, hey, do you think I could come out and, I'm coming out. Could I say hello? She gave me a beautiful tour of Dodger Stadium. But when you think of the opening of Camden Yards, you think Janet Marie Smith and Larry Lucchino, who also recently passed.
Yes.
How well did you know Larry? And is he similar in that, almost Al Langway that you said, was a visionary on so many different levels and just had ideas and was able to implement them and execute them?
Yeah, at first you're right. The ballpark is what it is because of Larry and Janet. No question about that. I worked for Larry. He was our team president for pretty much my whole time there, 10 years. And Larry was very passionate. And because of that, he was emotional and he could get a little angry sometimes. But, he knew exactly what he wanted to do. And Janet was the perfect person to carry it out. There's nobody even close to her when it comes to stadiums. I mean, I was in awe of her the entire time that I worked with her. And when we saw when we first started looking at the concepts, long before the public got to see them, all of us knew that we had a hit on our hand. Must have been like a rock star with a song that is going to be really good before it comes out. I think that's how we felt about the ballpark. And during the construction, we were still playing at Memorial Stadium. I used to take the visiting writers on tours of the construction site. And I was so prideful and I was so excited to do that because there was nothing about it that wasn't awesome. Everybody that came through there, when they left, they were in awe of what we were doing. And, Janet, I worked very closely with Janet, and we were trying to, because I don't know if you remember, but Memorial Stadium was not a great park, but it had great memories. The Orioles won there, the Colts won there, and people were not real thrilled about it at the beginning. And when I remember we announced the new ballpark in May of 1988, after we had just lost our first 21 games, which didn't help any. But when the mayor of Baltimore made the announcement, he got booed. He did it out on the field, and he got booed. And so we knew we had kind of a sell job, but we knew at the end of the day it was going to end well. And so we were doing these tours all around the state. And Janet had this is back when, she had put a slideshow together, and so I went to 4 or 5 of her presentations, and then I started doing some as well because we had so many requests and we had so many places we wanted to visit. And I'll never forget the things that she said, and they exactly happened. I mean, I think if I could think of if I had one way to describe what she wanted to do there and what she did, and it manifested itself so well, was she would say, we want to build a ballpark that when you walk down the street, you don't necessarily know that you're walking next to a ballpark. And meaning that she wanted the fabric, the outside of the ballpark, the architecture to blend in with the rest of the city, that it was just a part of the fabric of the city. And they completely nailed it. I mean, I was just walking here the other day. I went up Saturday because they named the press box after a longtime Baltimore writer named Jim Hinneman. And I was walking over to a place that we were having an after party for Jim. And I was thinking that the whole time I was walking along the sidewalk there, I was thinking that same thought, like, there it is. I mean, that's not exactly a ballpark on the outside. It doesn't have to be. And it completely nailed it. And then when our first game in Camden Yards was actually an exhibition game against the Mets. We played them on Saturday, and then we opened the season on Monday against the Indians. But on that Saturday, we played the Mets, and they were literally putting on the final touches of the ballpark while the teams were taking batting practice. And anyway, it was, when the game was over, we played the Mets. I remember Cal Jr. said, it's hard to believe there's never been a game played in the stadium before. And that was like the most perfect thing you could have said about the ballpark. They wanted an old time ballpark with modern amenities. And they did it, and I was, like I said, I was just there Saturday, and there's been development downtown that you can see from inside the bowl, but the ballpark still looks great. The decision, and there was some back and forth on whether they should leave the warehouse up in right field, and because some people thought that if you take it down, you could see the inner harbor. But thank God they kept that up. People a lot smarter than me made that decision, and not only because of the brick giving you that feeling of Baltimore and all, but also because it makes the ballpark seem smaller. It makes the ballpark feel intimate, even though it's not a small park, but it feels like a small park.
Yeah.
And it's because the warehouse is so big that it sets it sets it into a different mindset when you look at it.
Rick, I do this with former players when I interview them. I look at the managers that they played for, whether in their minor league days or at the big league level. So just rattling off the managers: Joe Altobelli, Earl Weaver, second stint; Cal Ripken Sr., Frank Robinson, Johnny Oates with the Rays, the first; Larry Rothschild, Hal McRae, Lou Piniella, Joe Madden, Kevin Cash. It's a tremendous list. So the best storyteller out of that group that I mentioned, and the one guy that if I could put you in a restaurant tomorrow to have a meal with, who are the guys at the top of your list there?
Well, Lou Piniella was an amazing. I felt so bad for Lou because we didn't win and we didn't have the horses to win, and he had such a hard time with that. Lou was the kind of manager that I don't think that he would have taken a young team and made it a really good team. I think he would have taken, if he had the same talent as you or I had, he was going to beat you more times. He would take a veteran club and make it a great club. But I don't think he had the patience to do the young thing. But he was a great storyteller. And when he passed Earl Weaver on the manager's win list, we did a press conference with Earl and Lou on together at the same time. And it was hilarious because Lou played for Earl in Elmira up in New York when he was an Oriole prospect. And it was unbelievable, the stories that both of them were telling about each other. I think Lou was a great storyteller. I was afraid of Earl for the first year. I was assistant PR director. I didn't know what to do. And he's another one that I saw, he labored, we just didn't have the horses to win when he came back. obviously Joe Madden's still a very dear friend of mine, almost like an older brother. And, by far the most positive manager of that group was Joe Madden. Joe was saying in 2006 that we were going to turn things around. Now, we had just finished, we would go on to finish the last 9 of our first 10 years. And we were in the middle of like the 9th year. And he was like, no, we're going to make this a place where people aren't going to want to play, and then we would leave his office and we'd be like, sure, Joe, whatever you say. And it happened. He made that happen. No one wanted to play us at the Trop, nobody wanted to play us anywhere for that matter. I mean, and to watch him change the culture and how he did it. And, it's pretty cool to have a front row seat to watch somebody do that, and he did it. He did it simply by building trust with the players, and he let them be who they were because he trusted them. Like we never had a dress code on the road. Everybody else had to wear coats and ties. We didn't, because he trusted the players would know what to do and how to do it. And in return, they respected him because of that. And so when, he had this thing where he had like 5 players he would pick out of the team, and he called them his bulls, the guys that were kind of the leaders of the team. And it would be not just 5 position guys. It might be a reliever, a starter, and then maybe 3 position guys, or a Latin guy, someone that represented part of the groups of the clubhouse. And he got those guys invested. And once that happened, I remember the first time we did a dress trip, we did these themed dress trips. Well, let me tell you something. Nobody did those. Okay. No one ever did those in any sport. And all of a sudden we're doing it. And I have to admit, I was a little hesitant. I'm like, I don't think these guys are going to go. They're not going to show up tomorrow wearing a cowboy uniform or whatever. We had a beach trip. I mean, we did like 30 of them. The beach trip was probably the maybe one of the more odd ones, but we did like military and cowboys and anything you can think of. And he would take suggestions from people as well. And I didn't think anybody would really go for it. And the first time we did one, every single player got dressed up. Not a few guys, with a couple guys that didn't do it. No, every player got dressed up. I think the first one we did was just simply like a hat tour, like wear a hat. And everybody, did their darndest to come up with something that was a little different, which of course he loved. But the end result of that was that they came together as a group. And even at the end, or even the other thing that we did was we started doing these celebrations in the clubhouse after a win.
Yeah. And
if you went in there, you would think it was a high school team that had just won the state championship. It was insane. I mean, they would go, the players really got into it. Joe put a disco ball up in the clubhouse, and they picked a song that was probably not something appropriate for underage kids, and then some of them would bring in an instrument or something, and they did something different all the time, but it was raucous and it was fun, and everybody looked forward to it. And and Joe I remember one time he wanted to have, we had animals in the clubhouse before the game. We had a big python, we had penguins, we had parrots. And then one time he wanted to have a mariachi band, and the mariachi band was late getting there and they weren't able to perform pregame. So we got them tickets, and the guy texted me during the game. He goes, you think, they'd want us to play if they win? And so after the game, I said, well, hold on, I'll ask Joe. We ended up losing. And I said to Joe, I'm not going to have him play. And he goes, oh, yes, you are. Get him down here. So we had this mariachi band playing in the clubhouse after we had just lost a game. And, I guarantee you that's never happened before or since. But that was the kind of fun that we had. And it led to mutual respect, which led to great communication. And so, you never, ever saw Joe get on a player, out in the public, in the dugout or whatever. You never saw Joe get mad at a player because he wouldn't do it. Now, he would afterwards, but he would do it in private. And he wasn't, a lot of times when you see a manager or a coach yell at a player like that, it's almost like he's saying, that's your fault. Look, everybody, he was wrong. It wasn't me. And Joe would never, ever do that to a player. And I think that they really respected that so much. And it was so cool to be around that. And I'm not taking it away. I saw Weaver. I had Weaver for 1 year. I had Lou for 3 difficult years. I don't know who. I mean, pretty hard to argue that Weaver wasn't the best manager of that group, but I just was around Joe longer, and I got to watch him work his magic like I did. So he was obviously my favorite.
31 years from the PR standpoint, how did things stay the same? What was the biggest change for you in terms of learning how we're going to execute the new ways to sell the team, sell the players? Because baseball.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, social media changed everything. We did media training every year during spring training, and you don't get a lot of time because they start losing their focus. So I usually figured about 45 minutes was the max, of where we could actually speak to them. And I would bring someone in, and we would talk about a lot of things for years. And then the last 4 or 5 years I was there, it was just basically just talking about social media and how it could be a great tool, how it could also, if it was used unwisely, emotionally after a game, how it was not wise, but it could be a great tool. What I really enjoyed about it was, I always told, to me, the biggest challenge that we had as the salaries escalated, who was making what the players on the field were going to make that night. He was making that in 1 year. So how do you find common ground where you can find that guy who's making what that player's making and that guy's making in 1 year what that player's making tonight? How do you find that common ground? And social media was kind of that way to do that. David Price used it as well as anyone. And, even if it was something like, like Price had a French Bulldog, maybe that's a way where you connect, where fans would say, oh, I have a French Bulldog too. Anything to find a connection with the players. And that to me, that just continued the whole time I worked from 1984 until 2016. That divide just kept getting bigger and bigger every year. It was harder and harder to make that connection as the salaries grew and the exposure grew and the spotlight grew. And so that was the, the really hardest part, was basically telling players, you're a player, but if you're on Twitter, you're actually an editor of a newspaper. It's your own newspaper. And you're going to be speaking in headlines, but you're going to be speaking and people are going to read it. And so we really banged our head against the wall as best we could. I was pretty lucky there, and we didn't have any terrible incidents when it came to social media. We had a few, and I would have to talk to the players and perhaps their agents and just try to get them to, back down a little bit on what they were saying. But that was probably the biggest challenge was that, was that whole educating them about social media, and that it really couldn't be, it just couldn't be this emotional release tool.
So who would have been, from the time that you were with the Orioles and then the early years with the Rays, didn't have it available as a player, Twitter, social media, who would have been a star
on social media?
Yeah.
That's a great question. Let's see. We had, it's some of the guys that aren't exactly household names, but we had a kid by the name of Jim Traber with the Orioles. And Jim was one of these people that he was just one of those people. Like if he walked up to a golf club and he had never seen a golf club before, he'd knock it on the green. Or if he had never seen a bowling ball before, he'd get a strike. And he played football at Oklahoma State, and he played baseball, and he was around the big leagues for probably 7 or 8 years, and he could do anything. He could sing. He would have been a star on social media and he had a sharp mind. The other one that comes to mind, of course, would have been Billy Ripken. Billy was really, I used to say Billy was kind of the opposite of Cal. Cal had this very carefully coiffed image, about not, he was very thoughtful about everything that he did, and Billy was completely the opposite of that. He a lot of times just did things and then thought about it. And I loved him to death. I'm still text with him from time to time. Just texted him a couple of weeks ago, and we're still friends. And I love the guy. He would have been a superstar if social media was around.
Rick, last one for you. And I just kind of thought of this, but we always talk about the prospects coming up and all the stuff that goes on with that. Maybe they're going to be the savior. It's a shot in the arm to the organization. Can you recall one guy coming up who had that, just that look of the deer in the headlights, but, and it was your job to sort of, introduce him to the media, really get him going. Maybe you saw him in spring training, maybe not, but just that one guy who maybe you had a reservation about, maybe he's not going to get this right away, but maybe pleasantly surprised you along the way too.
Well, I'll give you two players. I mean, one of them, which didn't end that well, was Delman Young. When Delman came up, I remember the first press conference that we did after he signed. We brought him to the Trop and had him down on the field, and he met the media. And I always felt like with those younger guys like that were not didn't play college ball, they weren't used to a lot of lights and stuff, that I always thought it was better to, instead of doing a formal press conference with them up at a table with the lights on them and all, I always thought it was better to get them on the field or in the dugout where at least they had been and they had some comfort level there. So I remember his first time meeting the media, it did not go well. He had a chip on his shoulder from the beginning, and, people were asking him like, hey, how much does this day mean to you? You're in the big leagues. And Delman was like, yeah, I've been kind of expecting this since I was like 13. And so he started off on a bad foot and, tried like heck to work with him. And then we had the incident where he threw a bat and hit an umpire when he was at Durham. And so he had to do a lot of community service as a result of that because of the team. And I worked with him on that very, very closely and tried to help him with messaging and stuff. He just didn't really want to admit that maybe this was new to him, And then I had Will Myers. When Will Myers came up, I remember his first day was at Fenway Park, and he was wide-eyed and he was awesome. I sat with him in the clubhouse that day. He got there that morning and he was in the lineup. And I can remember just sitting with him for about 15 minutes, trying to calm him down a little bit when it came to the media part of it. I don't think he was not calm about the baseball part, but he was in Boston and he was, he had gotten so much attention as a minor league player and a prospect. And it was great just to sit down with him and get him to relax a little bit. And then, you know what? He was always really good. His career he's had a pretty solid career. I don't know if he's still playing anymore or not, but it was kind of, he would always come to me in the next couple of years, and when he had a question and ask me, is this the right way to do that? And so I felt like I had made some steps with him, but he was very bright-eyed. He was great though. He was a sponge, and that really helped in his development as he moved up the ladder.
Rick, I'm going to perhaps be right behind your wife when I say I think we've got the makings of your third book. I know I went longer than I originally said, but wonderful stuff, great stories. I appreciate taking the time with us, and hopefully down the road we can do this again.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. Have a great day.
Rick Vaughn, thank you, sir.
See ya.
Rick Vaughn joining us, 30-plus years, PR, Baltimore Orioles, Washington Redskins, and the Tampa Bay Rays organization as well. Was involved in so many different things. Didn't really get into the Rays making it to the World Series in 2008. That is something we can do down the road with Rick. We continue with our Lennox on Baseball live streams, our daily recaps of what goes on around Major League Baseball. Day 33 is up and available on the X, formerly known as Twitter. Thursday, we're going to do it's the first week where we're going to line up and we're going to knock out 2 interviews. I'm so glad we were able to connect with Rick here. But on Thursday, going to visit with Jonathan Mayo from MLB Pipeline. Worked with Jonathan for USA Baseball events with MLB Advanced Media over the years, and he's going to join us and talk about his former book that was released in the last couple of years of guys making their journey and getting to the big leagues. So Jonathan Mayo coming up on Thursday as well. Again, our thanks to Rick Vaughn, 30-plus years as a PR man with the Baltimore Orioles, the Washington Redskins, and the Tampa Bay Rays organization. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday, everybody.